In 1590, English sailors approached Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The governor of the colony, John White, had returned after 3 long years away in England. He expected to find his daughter, his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, and 115 colonists waiting for him. Instead, he found empty houses, overgrown gardens, and a settlement that looked as if its inhabitants had simply walked away. The cooking fires were cold. Personal belongings remained in homes. But every single person had vanished without a trace. Carved into a wooden post was a single word: CROATOAN. No distress mark accompanied it. No bodies were found. No signs of struggle. 115 people had disappeared into the American wilderness, and more than 400 years later, we still have no definitive answer to what happened to them. What you're about to learn contradicts everything you've been taught about the early colonization of America. The official story tells of failed colonies, harsh winters, and Native American conflicts. But the evidence from Roanoke suggests something far more complex. This mystery involves international espionage, secret maps that have only recently been analyzed with modern technology, archaeological discoveries that challenge centuries of assumptions, and genetic evidence that suggests the colonists may have survived much longer than anyone imagined. Some experts now believe the Roanoke colonists made a calculated decision that saved their lives but erased their identity. Others think they became victims of the first major cover-up in American history. The truth may be more extraordinary than either explanation. The story begins not on Roanoke Island in 1587, but in the royal courts of England in 1584. Queen Elizabeth I was locked in an undeclared war with Spain, the world's dominant superpower. Spanish ships controlled the seas. Spanish gold from the Americas financed armies that threatened Protestant England. Sir Walter Raleigh, one of Elizabeth's favorites, proposed an audacious plan: establish an English colony in the New World that could serve as a base for privateers to raid Spanish ships. This wasn't just about exploration or trade. It was a military operation disguised as a settlement. Raleigh received a charter giving him rights to colonize North America, but there was a condition. The colony had to be self-sustaining within a specific time frame, or the charter would be revoked. This created enormous pressure to succeed quickly, regardless of the cost. The first expedition in 1585 was essentially a reconnaissance mission. Over 100 men landed on Roanoke Island, led by Ralph Lane. They built a fort, explored the surrounding area, and established contact with the local Algonquian tribes. The relationship started peacefully, but deteriorated rapidly. The English demanded food supplies that the Native Americans could not provide without starving themselves. Lane became convinced that the tribal leader Wingina was planning an attack. In a preemptive strike, Lane's men ambushed Wingina and killed him. This act of violence poisoned relations with the indigenous population and set the stage for everything that followed. When Sir Francis Drake arrived in 1586 with ships returning from Caribbean raids, Lane and his men abandoned the colony and sailed back to England. The first Roanoke settlement had lasted less than a year. But Raleigh was not discouraged. He organized a second expedition with a different approach. Instead of soldiers and fortune seekers, this colony would include families, women, and children. They would build a genuine settlement, not a military base. In 1587, 3 ships carrying 115 colonists set sail from England. Among them was John White, appointed governor, and his pregnant daughter, Eleanor. The plan was to stop briefly at Roanoke to pick up a small garrison left behind, then continue north to the Chesapeake Bay area, which had been identified as more suitable for a permanent settlement. But the ship's pilot, Simon Fernandez, refused to take them further. Historical records suggest Fernandez was eager to go privateering and didn't want to waste time transporting colonists. He forced them to stay on Roanoke Island, the site of Lane's failed colony, where relations with Native Americans were already hostile. The colonists were stranded in the worst possible location from the very beginning. Within a month, disaster struck. George Howe, one of the colonists, was attacked and killed by Native Americans while fishing alone. The colonists tried to retaliate, but attacked the wrong tribe, further antagonizing the indigenous population. Governor White realized the colony desperately needed supplies and reinforcements from England. The colonists convinced him to return to England to organize a relief expedition. Before he left, his daughter gave birth to Virginia Dare on August 18, 1587, the first English child born in America. 9 days later, White sailed for England, leaving his newborn granddaughter and daughter behind. He expected to return within a few months. Instead, it would be 3 years before he saw Roanoke again. What kept White away for so long was not lack of concern, but the intervention of global politics.
When he arrived in England in late 1587, the country was preparing for the greatest naval threat it had ever faced. Spain was assembling a massive invasion force called the Spanish Armada. Every available ship was either conscripted for defense or forbidden to leave port. White managed to secure 2 small ships in 1588, but they were intercepted by Spanish vessels and forced to return. The Armada was defeated in August 1588, but England remained on high alert. It wasn't until 1590 that White finally secured passage on a privateering expedition that agreed to stop at Roanoke. By then, the colonists had been alone for 3 years, with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no communication with England. When White's ship anchored off Roanoke on August 15, 1590, his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, the crew saw smoke rising from the island. Encouraged, they fired cannons and played trumpets to announce their arrival. There was no response. Landing the next day, they found the settlement abandoned. The houses had been taken down carefully, not destroyed. The area was enclosed by a high palisade, suggesting the colonists had time to fortify their position. On one of the posts, someone had carved the letters CRO. On a tree at the entrance, carved 5 feet up, was the complete word CROATOAN. White had instructed the colonists that if they left the settlement, they should carve their destination into a tree. If they were in distress, they should include a Maltese cross. There was no cross. This suggested the evacuation was planned, not forced. White was convinced the colonists had relocated to CROATOAN Island, about 50 miles south, home to the CROATOAN tribe with whom the English had maintained friendly relations. The tribe's chief, Manteo, had traveled to England and been baptized as a Christian. He had returned with the colonists and was considered an ally. White pleaded with the ship's captain to sail to CROATOAN immediately, but a storm was approaching, and the privateers were eager to return to raiding. They refused. The ships left the next day, and White never returned to America. He died sometime around 1593, never knowing what happened to his family. The mystery of Roanoke had begun, and for 4 centuries it would remain unsolved. The question that has haunted historians is simple. If the colonists left a clear message saying they went to CROATOAN, why did no one go look for them? The answer reveals a conspiracy that may have deliberately buried the truth. When England sent new expeditions to establish Jamestown in 1607, the leaders were instructed to search for Roanoke survivors. Captain John Smith, famous for his relationship with Pocahontas, made inquiries among Native American tribes. What he heard was disturbing. According to multiple indigenous sources, there had been English people living among tribes south of Jamestown. But Chief Powhatan, the dominant leader in the region, had ordered them killed just before the Jamestown colonists arrived. Smith recorded that Powhatan's men had massacred approximately 7 English settlements, killing men, women, and children. Why would Powhatan order such an attack? The answer may lie in the political situation among Native American tribes. Powhatan was building an empire, consolidating dozens of tribes under his control. The presence of English colonists allied with rival tribes threatened his expansion. By eliminating these settlements, he removed both a military threat and a potential source of European weapons for his enemies. But here's where the story becomes suspicious. Smith's superiors in the Virginia Company, the organization financing Jamestown, ordered him to stop investigating. They didn't want to hear about massacred colonists. They wanted investors to believe that colonizing America was safe and profitable. Revealing that the previous colony had been slaughtered would destroy confidence and funding. The official policy became to simply ignore Roanoke and focus on making Jamestown succeed. William Strachey, the secretary of Jamestown Colony, wrote detailed reports based on Native American testimonies. He claimed that Powhatan kept English prisoners and that some Roanoke colonists had definitely survived until around 1607. Strachey wrote that 4 English men, 2 boys, and 1 young woman were being held captive. He described them as teaching the natives to build European-style houses, but when Strachey sent these reports back to England, they were suppressed. The Virginia Company didn't publish them. Investors never saw them. For centuries, historians assumed the Roanoke colonists died shortly after 1587. Only in the 20th century, when researchers began examining unpublished documents in archives, did Strachey's reports come to light. The cover-up had worked for 300 years. But there's another layer to this mystery, one that involves a map that has been sitting in the British Museum for centuries, hiding secrets that were only discovered in 2012. When John White returned to England in 1587, he brought with him detailed maps and paintings of the Carolina coast. These weren't just artistic works, they were strategic intelligence, showing harbors, villages, resources, and potential settlement sites. One map, called the La Virginia Pars map, became famous for its beauty and accuracy. It hung in museums, was studied by historians, and was reproduced in countless textbooks. No one noticed what was hidden beneath the surface until researchers at the British Museum examined it with modern imaging technology. Beneath a patch on the map, carefully hidden for over 400 years, was a symbol. Using X-ray photography and multispectral imaging, researchers discovered that White had drawn a red and blue symbol at a specific location about 50 miles inland from Roanoke, near the Chowan and Roanoke rivers. This symbol matched symbols used elsewhere on the map to indicate fortified settlements. Someone had deliberately covered this symbol with a patch of paper that blended perfectly with the rest of the map. Why would White hide the location of a potential settlement site? The most logical explanation is that this was a secret relocation plan. If the Roanoke colony became untenable, the colonists would move to this hidden location. White couldn't reveal it publicly because Spanish spies in England were stealing English maps and reporting back to Madrid. If Spain discovered where the colonists had relocated, they would send forces to destroy them. Archaeological teams immediately began searching the area indicated on White's hidden map. This region, called Site X by researchers, is near the Salmon Creek area in Bertie County, North Carolina. Beginning in 2013,
excavations uncovered something extraordinary. They found a 16th century English sword hilt, musket balls, copper fittings, and pottery that matched items known to have been brought by the Roanoke colonists. Even more intriguing, they found these English artifacts mixed with Native American artifacts, suggesting Europeans and indigenous people were living together. The dating of these items places them right around 1587 to 1620, exactly when the Roanoke colonists would have been alive. This wasn't a later colonial site. This was evidence of the lost colonists integrating with Native American communities. DNA evidence provides another stunning piece of the puzzle. In the 1930s, a researcher named Haywood Pierce began collecting family histories from people living in the Robeson County area of North Carolina, home to the Lumbee tribe. The Lumbee have long claimed descent from the Roanoke colonists. Unlike most Native American tribes in the region, many Lumbee had European surnames identical to Roanoke colonists: Dare, Cooper, Bailey, Berry, and dozens of others. Pierce documented 41 Roanoke surnames among the Lumbee population.
For decades, mainstream historians dismissed this as coincidence or later intermixing. But genetic studies conducted in the 21st century have confirmed substantial European DNA in the Lumbee population, with markers consistent with English ancestry from the Elizabethan period. The most compelling genetic evidence comes from mitochondrial DNA studies. Mitochondrial DNA is passed only through the maternal line, allowing researchers to trace ancestry back centuries. Several Lumbee families possess mitochondrial DNA haplotypes that are extremely rare among Native American populations, but common among English populations from the Devon and Cornwall regions, exactly where many Roanoke colonists originated. The statistical probability of this occurring through random, later intermixing is extraordinarily low. The genetic evidence strongly suggests that English women from the Roanoke colony married into Native American tribes and had children who survived to pass on their DNA to descendants living today. But if the colonists integrated with Native Americans and survived, creating communities that lasted for decades, why did they abandon their English identity so completely? The answer may lie in the brutal reality of colonial politics. By 1607, when Jamestown was established, any surviving Roanoke colonists would have lived among Native Americans for 20 years. Their children would have been raised in indigenous culture. They would speak Algonquin languages fluently, perhaps better than English. They would have adopted Native American clothing, customs, and survival skills. Most importantly, they would have understood that European colonization meant displacement and death for Native Americans. When new English colonists arrived, the Roanoke survivors faced an impossible choice: reveal themselves and potentially become pawns in conflicts between Europeans and natives, or hide their ancestry and protect the communities that had sheltered them. There's evidence they chose concealment. Several early Jamestown accounts mention encountering Native Americans with unusual features: gray eyes, light hair, and the ability to speak a few English words. One report describes indigenous children playing a game that involved marking the ground with sticks in patterns resembling the English alphabet. A tribal elder reportedly told colonists that his grandmother had been a white woman who came from the sea. But when English colonists pressed for more information, trying to locate survivors, the Native Americans stopped cooperating. Word had spread about Powhatan's massacres of English settlers. The message was clear: admitting to harboring English colonists was dangerous. The archaeological evidence supports the theory of deliberate dispersal. Rather than staying together as one community, the Roanoke colonists appear to have split into multiple groups that integrated with different tribes across a wide geographic area. Sites with English artifacts from the late 16th century have been found not just at Site X, but also on Hatteras Island, the modern name for CROATOAN, and at several locations inland along major rivers. This distribution pattern suggests a coordinated strategy. Small groups of English colonists would have been easier to absorb into existing Native American communities without disrupting their social structures. It would also provide redundancy. If one group was discovered and attacked, others would survive. This strategy may have been planned from the beginning. Remember that the colonists carved CROATOAN, not help or starving. They left personal belongings behind, but took tools, weapons, and anything useful. They dismantled houses carefully, salvaging materials. This was an organized evacuation, not a desperate flight. Governor White had discussed contingency plans with the colonists before leaving. They knew England was at war with Spain. They knew relief might be delayed. The plan to integrate with friendly tribes may have been the rational response to an impossible situation. Stay on Roanoke and starve, or disperse into the interior and survive by abandoning their English identity. But there's a darker possibility that some researchers have explored. What if the colonists didn't just choose to leave? What if they were forced into a situation where integration was survival? Analysis of tree ring data from the late 1580s reveals that the Roanoke colonists arrived during the worst drought in the region in 800 years. Crops would have failed. Game would have been scarce. The colonists had limited agricultural knowledge and were dependent on trade with Native Americans. If the drought made it impossible for indigenous communities to share food without starving themselves, the colonists would have faced a grim reality. Their choices were to die on Roanoke, attempt to sail back to England in small boats across thousands of miles of ocean, or beg Native American tribes for shelter by offering the only things they had of value: European technology, tools, weapons, and their labor. In this scenario, the colonists would have become not integrated partners, but subordinated refugees. They would teach Native Americans to use English weapons, build European-style fortifications, and possibly provide genetic diversity to small tribes concerned about inbreeding. In exchange, they would receive food and protection. But they would do so on indigenous terms, not as English citizens establishing a colony. Their children would be raised as members of the tribes, not as English settlers. Within a generation, English identity would effectively disappear. This interpretation is supported by anthropological studies of other situations where small groups of refugees have been absorbed into larger populations. Cultural identity rarely survives intact for more than 2 generations without institutional support. The religious dimension of this mystery adds another layer of complexity. The Roanoke colonists were English Protestants living during a period of intense religious conflict. Catholic Spain and Protestant England were locked in what was essentially a holy war. Among the colonists was a group who may have had connections to a secret society called the School of Night, an intellectual circle that included Walter Raleigh, Christopher Marlowe, and others suspected of atheism and heresy by the Church. Some researchers have speculated that Roanoke was intended not just as a colony, but as a refuge for free thinkers escaping religious persecution. If true, this would mean the colonists had even more reason to hide from English authorities, who might view their unorthodox beliefs as dangerous. A controversial theory proposed by some historians suggests that at least some colonists deliberately chose to disappear. England in the 1580s was a surveillance state where religious dissent could mean execution. The New World offered a chance to escape. If colonists carved CROATOAN but actually went elsewhere, it would be the perfect misdirection.
Rescue parties would search the wrong location, while the colonists established hidden communities where they could live according to their own beliefs. This theory is impossible to prove, but it's worth noting that none of the Roanoke colonists ever attempted to return to English territory once Jamestown was established in 1607. Even if they were living peacefully among Native Americans, the arrival of new English colonies would have been common knowledge. Yet no colonist ever emerged to identify themselves and reclaim their English identity. Modern forensic archaeology is providing new tools to solve ancient mysteries. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at Croatoan Island have identified anomalies consistent with Elizabethan-era construction techniques. Excavations in 2020 uncovered what appears to be a workshop where European and Native American metalworking techniques were combined. Analysis of slag and metal fragments shows copper being worked in ways that don't match either pure European or pure indigenous methods, but rather a hybrid approach. This suggests knowledge transfer and collaboration, not just one group adopting another's techniques. The workshop dates to approximately 1590 to 1610, exactly when Roanoke colonists would have been active. Environmental DNA is the latest frontier in solving the Roanoke mystery. Scientists have extracted DNA from soil samples at archaeological sites associated with the lost colony. These samples contain not just human DNA, but also plant and animal DNA, providing a snapshot of what species were present at specific times. Preliminary results have identified European plant species that were not native to North America, including English wheat varieties and herb species commonly grown in Elizabethan gardens. The presence of these plants at sites dating to the 1590s strongly suggests European inhabitants were cultivating them. This environmental DNA creates a kind of invisible archaeological record that can't be erased or hidden the way physical artifacts can be. But perhaps the most fascinating recent discovery involves linguistics. The Lumbee tribe has preserved dozens of words in their language that appear to be corrupted Elizabethan English. These aren't modern English words borrowed later, but archaic terms that haven't been used in standard English for 400 years. For example, the Lumbee word for certain tools and household items matches 16th century English pronunciation patterns that had changed by the time other English colonies were established. Language evolves slowly in isolated communities. If Roanoke colonists taught English words to Native Americans in 1590, and those communities remained relatively isolated, the words would fossilize in the form they had in 1590, while English evolved differently in England and later colonies. Linguistic analysis provides a timestamp that's difficult to fake or explain through later contact. All of this evidence points toward a conclusion that challenges the traditional mystery narrative. The Roanoke colonists didn't vanish. They didn't die in some dramatic catastrophe. They didn't get abducted by aliens or fall victim to supernatural forces. They did something far more radical and, in many ways, more courageous. They walked away from European civilization and integrated into Native American societies. They chose survival over identity. They became indigenous. Their descendants are still alive today, carrying DNA and cultural memories of English ancestors, but living as members of Native American tribes. The mystery of the lost colony isn't where they went. It's why we've been so reluctant to accept that they consciously chose to stop being English. This resistance reveals something about how we construct historical narratives. The story of European colonization is supposed to be about civilization conquering wilderness, about Christian Europeans bringing light to savage lands. The Roanoke colonists don't fit that narrative. They suggest that sometimes European colonists looked at indigenous societies and saw something worth joining rather than conquering. They imply that English identity was negotiable, not sacred. They demonstrate that colonization could have taken a different path, one based on integration rather than domination. Every history textbook that describes Roanoke as an unsolved mystery, rather than acknowledging the evidence of indigenous integration, perpetuates a worldview that can't accept the possibility that Europeans might have chosen to become Native American. The final question is whether we'll ever have absolute proof. Could someone discover a letter written by a Roanoke colonist describing their decision to join the CROATOAN tribe? Could genetic testing definitively link a living person to Virginia Dare? Could an archaeological excavation uncover a European grave with a headstone bearing a Roanoke name and a Native American burial style? These discoveries are possible. But even without a smoking gun, the preponderance of evidence, archaeological, genetic, linguistic, and documentary, all points in the same direction. The colonists survived by dispersing, integrating, and abandoning their European identity. The lost colony was never lost. It dissolved like salt in water, becoming invisible but never ceasing to exist. What does it mean that for 400 years we've called them the lost colony instead of the integrated colony? What does it say about our assumptions that we've treated their disappearance as a mystery instead of a choice? And what should we make of the fact that when indigenous people told early colonists exactly what happened, those colonists either didn't believe them or deliberately suppressed the information? The real mystery of Roanoke may not be what happened to the colonists. The real mystery may be why we've needed them to remain lost. Why we've preferred an unsolved riddle to an answer that challenges how we understand the founding of America.
Every carved tree that might bear the word CROATOAN, every strand of DNA carrying English markers in indigenous populations, every corrupted Elizabethan word preserved in tribal language is a ghost trying to tell us a story we're only now beginning to hear.